Welcome back. So in the last section, we saw how we can manually trigger scaling rules to add or remove instances from our scaling group. So what are the automated ways that we can trigger scaling rules? Well, the first is scheduled tasks. You can create up to 20 scheduled tasks according to input parameters. If a scheduled task fails to trigger the execution of a scaling rule because the scaling group is executing a scaling activity or because the scaling group is disabled, then the scheduled task will be automatically retried. There's something called the launch expiration time. Inside of this time window, scheduled tasks will keep periodically retrying. Once you've exceeded that launch expiration time window, the scheduled task will be abandoned. It will be considered to have failed. If multiple tasks are scheduled at similar times to execute a scaling rule for a particular scaling group, the earliest task triggers the scaling activity first. Other tasks will attempt to execute the rule within their launch expiration time, but a scaling group can only execute one scaling activity at a time, so those other tasks might have to retry several times. If another scheduled task is still triggering attempts within its launch expiration time after the scaling activity has finished, the scaling rule will be executed and the corresponding scaling activity is triggered. Just to make that a little clearer, if you have multiple scheduled tasks that occur very near to each other in time, the first task that's scheduled will of course execute first. While the scaling activity that first task has triggered is going on, your other scheduled scaling tasks may have to wait. They might have to retry several times. But as long as your first scaling task happens before the launch expiration time expires for your other scaling tasks, then they'll be able to continue retrying and eventually successfully execute. If multiple tasks are scheduled at the same time, the latest scheduled task is the one that will be executed. So if you have multiple tasks that are supposed to happen at the same point in time, the one you created last will be the first to execute. That's how scheduled tasks work. In a moment, we'll take a look at that in the console. But before we do that, let's see how we can create and manage event-triggered tasks. So event-triggered tasks do not need to be unique. Event-triggered tasks cannot execute during a scaling group's cooldown period, unlike manual or scheduled tasks. And event-triggered tasks will be rejected if the scaling group is already executing another scaling activity. They will just not run. So if another activity is executing, then an event-triggered task will give up. It doesn't have a retry window like a scheduled task does. It will simply fail, and the next time the alarm is triggered to run that task, then it will run again. Let's take a look at both of these types of tasks in the Alibaba Cloud console. So here we are back in the console. Let's go ahead and try creating some scheduled tasks. First, we'll save our event-triggered tasks for later. So here under Scaling Tasks, I have this Scheduled Tasks section. I'll click on that, and I'll create two. I'll create one scheduled task to add 2 instances, and another to remove 2 instances. So I'll click on Create Scheduled Tasks, and I'll create one called Add 2 that should execute today at, let's say, 5:43 p.m., so in just a few minutes. Then I will apply it to our test scaling group, and I will use an existing scaling rule because we already have a rule to scale up our group by 2. And I'll choose that rule. And then I have to say, what is the time interval within which this rule should retry if it fails on its first run? And I'll say it should keep retrying for 600 seconds if it fails to execute the first time. And I'll click OK. And now that rule is ready. And then I'll create another one to scale the group back down that should trigger a few minutes later. I'll call that remove 2. Remove 2 instances. The description is not mandatory, but you can add one if you want. And again, I will set that for, let's say we set our original, let's say 5:45. And then the scaling group will be test scaling group. And we'll use an existing rule, which is scale down to. And I'll click OK to create that rule. So in just a few seconds here, it will be 5:43 p.m. where I am, and then I should see this first rule execute. So let's go back to the scaling group view and go to the dashboard for our test scaling group. And let's see if we can watch this activity get triggered. We should see an activity get created in just a few seconds that should add 2 more instances to the group. It's now 5:43, so let's go ahead and refresh. And sure enough, you can see there's an activity triggering right now, executing right now, called add 2 instances. So that means our scheduled task has triggered our scaling rule that adds 2 instances, and that rule has created a scaling activity that's adding the 2 instances for us. and that should take a few moments. Let's wait for that. All right, that task was successfully executed. It's now 5:44 p.m. And in just a moment, in just a minute, we should see our remove two instances task trigger. So the add two instances task has succeeded, meaning our group total is now 4 instances. If we wait about another 40 seconds or so, then we should see the remove two instances scaling activity get triggered, because remember we have a scheduled task here to remove two that's set to run at 5:45. So let's go back to scaling groups, go back to the overview, and I'll wait for that. We can fast forward through that, and when that happens, I'll come back to the video. All right, so it's now 5:45. Let's refresh and see if our task is executing. Sure enough, remove two is executing right now. There's a total of 4 in the group, but 2 of them are being removed and 2 are in service. In just a moment, the total should go down to 2. And sure enough, we are now at 2 instances. So that worked. Now that we've tried scheduled tasks, let's try creating some event-triggered tasks. So I'll go over to event-triggered tasks here in the left-hand menu, and we'll create 2 event-triggered tasks. I'll call this one scale out, and it will look at average CPU usage. It will monitor all of the instances in this scaling group, and if the average CPU usage is over 80% for 1 minute, one time, then we'll trigger the scale up to rule. And I'll click OK to create that rule. And then we'll create another event-triggered task that does the opposite. This one will be scale in. And what he will do is, again, monitor the instances in the test scaling group. But now, when the CPU usage for those instances drops below 20% for one time at a 1 minute monitoring interval, he will scale the group down. So we'll click OK to create those 2 rules. These 2 rules have now taken effect. And actually, our instances right now are not doing anything at all. So what will happen is that the scale in rule will continuously try to trigger and will continuously fail because we're already at the group minimum size. So if I were to go back to my scaling group and look at the scaling activities, we should start seeing these remove two tasks get triggered, but they won't have any effect because we're already at the minimum size here. So now that we've got those 2 tasks set up and ready to trigger, we need to find a way to increase the CPU load of our instances. So let's do that. So I'll open the ECS console, and I'll find a way from the ECS console to log into my instances and install a stress testing tool. Once I've done that, we can start monitoring the instances in Cloud Monitor and look at their CPU utilization to see if we're likely to trigger our scale out rule. Let's fast forward through some of this configuration, and I'll come back once the stress test is running. So after a little bit of behind-the-scenes work, we've set up a Cloud Monitor dashboard where we can see the CPU usage and other metrics for our auto-scaling group ECS instances, and we're running a stress test in the background that should start to show up on these charts in just a minute. You can also see that while we were waiting, we have several rejected scaling activities. These were probably triggered by this task here, scale in, which would have been triggered by the low CPU usage on our 2 ECS instances. Remember, this task will run anytime average CPU usage is below 20%. Before, our ECS instances were doing nothing, so that would have triggered an alarm for this event-triggered task here that would have tried to run the remove to scaling rule. That would have failed because our scaling group is already at its minimum size of 2. So let's go back to the Cloud Monitor console and see how our CPU stress test is faring here. You can see that CPU usage is rapidly increasing for our 2 ECS instances. In a moment, that should cause our scale out event-triggered task to run. So let's wait for that. Here in scaling activities, we can see that the scale down was rejected. Let's wait for the scale up to occur. We should scale up to 4 instances in just a moment here. So let's fast forward a little bit in time to when that starts to take place. And sure enough, after a brief wait, we can see that we're now executing an add to instances scaling activity as a result of our event-triggered task having been triggered by our monitoring metric. So our CPU usage, our average CPU usage is now above 80%, and it has been for more than 1 minute, which triggers an alarm that causes this scale out triggered task to run our add to scaling rule. And that add to scaling rule triggers a scaling activity that adds 2 instances to the pool. So now there's a total of 4 instances in service. And if we go back to the console, we can see our CPU usage is still pretty high, but if we wait another minute or so, it should drop back down. And once that happens, the scale in rule should trigger, which will remove 2 of the instances from the pool. So let's go back and wait for that. And sure enough, after waiting a little while, we can see we're now removing 2 ECS instances. And if we go look at our event triggered task list, we can see there's an alarm set here on scale in because our CPU usage is now below 20%. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see that here. There's a little delay in the monitoring metrics. Yes, actually, sure enough, you can see our usage is back near 0. So our CPU usage has dropped, and that has caused our scaling activity to trigger, and our group size should now be back to 2. There's just one thing left that we should cover. How do you delete all of this? So let's try deleting our scaling group. Again, the delete mode that's used when you delete from the console, from the web interface, is what we call force delete. What that should do is automatically delete both of these ECS instances as well as both of our scaling rules. So let's try that. So I'll click on delete here, and you'll see you get a warning. It will remove all ECS instances, and I'll click OK. And keep in mind that if you did do this and some of your instances were manually added to the scaling group, those instances you manually added will not be deleted. They'll still live on. It's just the automatically created ECS instances that will be removed. So you can see the group is now in the deleting state. What's interesting though is here I can see I still have my 2 scheduled tasks and I still have my event triggered tasks. Oh, excuse me, the event triggered tasks were cleared for me automatically by the scaling group deletion process, but the scheduled tasks still remain in the console and I can delete those by hand. So let's go ahead and do that, delete both of those, and then go back to scaling groups, and sure enough, our scaling group is gone. And that's it for this section of the course. Thank you for joining me for this demo.